It was the sound that first caught my attention, the soft, rhythmic splashing of water, the kind you'd expect to hear in a bathtub. But this was different. I was supposed to be alone in the house, my husband off at work, and my stepson in his room, studying, or so I thought. I walked down the hallway, and as I passed the bathroom, the door was slightly ajar. A glance inside was enough to stop me in my tracks, my heart racing as my breath caught in my throat. What I saw wasn't what I had anticipated. My stepson, no older than 16, was standing in the tub, the water running as he washed himself. In that moment, everything in my world seemed to shift, as a strange sense of responsibility mixed with confusion and something darker I couldn't yet name. What was I supposed to do? I should probably start by saying I'm not proud of what happened, but the truth is, I've never been very good at hiding the messy bits of my life. My name is Emily, and I married Paul 3 years ago. He's a good man, steady, reliable, the kind of guy who always does what he says he will. When we first met, I felt like I'd found someone who could offer me stability after years of uncertainty. I had never imagined that my life would come to be shaped by someone else's child, but that's exactly what happened. Paul's son, Ryan, was only 12 when we first got together, and I think he felt a bit out of place in our newly blended family. He was a quiet boy, often wrapped up in his books, but always with a distant, thoughtful air about him. I noticed it right away, that hunger in his eyes, like he was searching for something he couldn't quite put his finger on. At first, I tried my best to bond with him, taking him out for movies or helping him with school projects. But no matter how hard I tried, he kept me at arm's length. I didn't take it personally. I knew how hard it must have been for him. After all, his mother was out of the picture, and though Paul had custody, the absence of her presence was a ghost that hung over everything. That day, the house was quiet, eerily so. Paul had left for work early, and Ryan had stayed home, his school on break. We didn't have any plans, but I'd assumed he'd be holed up in his room, just like usual, on his computer or reading some fantasy novel. The house, our little 3-bedroom in a sleepy suburban neighborhood, smelled faintly of coffee and dust, like any other morning. The sun was just beginning to creep through the curtains, casting long, golden beams across the hardwood floors. I was moving through the house in a haze, making breakfast when I heard that strange sound, gentle splashing, almost melodic, coming from the bathroom. It didn't make sense at first. Ryan was always so private, so closed off. The bathroom door was barely cracked open, and it seemed like the kind of moment that shouldn't have been interrupted. But curiosity pulled me forward. I stood in the hallway, my pulse quickening as I tried to understand what was happening. It was a small, cozy bathroom, the kind where the faded tile always felt cold underfoot, and the mirror was forever streaked from the steam of showers. The shower curtain, drawn back just enough, revealed Ryan standing in the tub. The water was running over him, and his movements were slow, deliberate, as if he hadn't noticed me at all. My breath hitched. There was something about the moment that made everything feel too intimate, too exposed, and yet it wasn't anything outwardly inappropriate. He wasn't doing anything overtly wrong, nothing sexual in the obvious sense, but there was something about the scene, about the way he was washing himself, that made me feel like I had trespassed into a place I wasn't meant to be. In that second, I didn't know what to feel: confusion, discomfort, or an odd sense of responsibility. Maybe it was a mixture of all three. I hadn't expected to find myself in the position of stepping into something so private, so raw. I didn't know what to do. Would I leave him be? Would I pretend I hadn't seen anything? Or would I confront him, disrupt the silence that had settled between us all these years? The questions flooded my mind as I stood there, just outside the bathroom door, trying to decide whether to make my presence known. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. Ryan hadn't heard me. He was too absorbed in whatever it was he was doing, too lost in his own world. I should have backed away, should have quietly walked down the hallway and pretended like I hadn't seen anything. But my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene unfolding in front of me. The soft rush of water, the way he seemed to cleanse himself with such focus, there was something about it that made my stomach churn. It wasn't anything I could quite explain, just a feeling that settled deep in my gut, one that told me I had stumbled upon something too intimate, too private. I thought about turning around and going back to the kitchen. But then my mind raced. Was he okay? Was there something I didn't understand? I'd seen how Ryan had been retreating more and more into himself in recent months. He'd started acting out in small ways, skipping school a little more often, refusing to talk about his day. Paul hadn't noticed, or if he had, he hadn't said anything. Maybe he thought it was just the age. Boys went through phases, right? But something in the back of my mind kept nagging at me. Was I just imagining things, or was there a deeper issue with Ryan, one that I was missing? My thoughts raced as I fought with myself, debating whether to intervene. Should I just go in and say something? But what could I say? Hey, are you okay? How could I possibly ask that after what I'd just seen? And even more, why was I so uncomfortable with the idea of being there for him? What kind of stepmother was I? Before I could come to any sort of decision, Ryan's voice broke the silence, his words barely above a whisper, but they felt like a slap across my face. Are you just going to stand there? The words hit me harder than I expected. I blinked, almost forgetting how to breathe for a moment, and then I realized I had no idea how to respond. The thing that terrified me wasn't just that he'd caught me watching, but the way he seemed to know exactly why I was there. He didn't sound angry, though. He sounded resigned, almost tired. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. The tension in the air was thick now, palpable, like the humid steam filling the bathroom. I could feel my face flushing, my hands beginning to shake. How had this moment gone from innocent curiosity to something far more complicated? Sorry, I didn't mean to, I started, but my voice faltered. Ryan turned slightly in the tub, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. He didn't look embarrassed. There was no shame in his gaze. If anything, it was distant, detached, as if he'd expected me to be there all along. What are you doing? I asked, the words coming out too sharp, too defensive. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. It felt like the question I needed to ask, even though I knew it wasn't the right one. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping as he leaned against the edge of the tub. I'm washing myself. What does it look like? His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, a quiet defiance, like he was daring me to press further. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, to force some composure back into my voice. Ryan, are you all right? You've been acting different lately. We've been worried about you, you know? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for the bottle of soap by the edge of the tub, squeezing it between his fingers with a slow, deliberate motion. I could feel my heart racing, my mind a mess of conflicting emotions. What was I supposed to say to that? To this? Was this just normal for him, or had I misread everything up until this point? He was a teenager. Was this just what boys did? You're worried about me? He finally asked, a dark humor in his voice. I'm fine. Just don't make it a big deal, okay? I stepped closer to the door, my hand gripping the frame as I struggled with the words. Ryan, this is a big deal. You're changing, and I'm here, I care. I just want to know if you're okay. He didn't say anything at first, but his jaw tightened as if he was holding something back. I'm fine, he repeated, this time with more force. Then, after a long pause, he looked at me with an almost unsettling calm. You don't have to worry about me. But if you're really curious, I'm just figuring things out. That's all. I felt the weight of his words settle on me like a heavy cloud, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I should press him further or step back. But something about the way he said it, figuring things out, bothered me. There was an undertone there, something I didn't fully understand but felt too deeply to ignore. It felt like a clue, a hint that there was more to Ryan than I had been able to see. Something wasn't right, and yet he was pushing me away, not letting me in. I'm not trying to judge you. I said, my voice barely above a whisper now. I don't want you to be alone with whatever you're going through. You don't have to hide things from me, Ryan. His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I saw something break in him. A flicker of something, vulnerability, maybe, or frustration. I'm not hiding anything, he said quietly, his voice strained. You don't get it. You're not my mom. You don't have to care about everything I do. The words stung, even though I knew they weren't meant to hurt. He was just pushing me away like he always did. But in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about me catching him at an intimate moment. It was about him pushing me out, keeping me at a distance, refusing to let me see him fully. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of our disconnect, the distance between us that I had failed to close, no matter how hard I tried. I never said I was, I whispered, my voice trembling. But I do care about you, Ryan. He didn't answer, and after a moment, I turned away, my mind reeling. What was I supposed to do? What was he really asking for? I couldn't tell if this was the beginning of something I wasn't ready for, or if it was just another piece of the puzzle I would never fully understand. But I knew one thing for sure. The walls between us were higher than I had ever realized. And I didn't know how, or if, I could ever break them down. I didn't go back to the bathroom. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I slowly retreated down the hallway. Every step felt like a betrayal, as if I had abandoned Ryan in that small, steamy room to sort through something that neither of us was ready to face. I found myself pacing around the kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the counter, my mind spinning in a dozen different directions. What had just happened? And why did it feel like I had crossed a line, even when I hadn't meant to? But as I stood there, my thoughts shifted. Ryan's words kept echoing in my mind. I'm just figuring things out. He hadn't just been washing himself, he'd been doing something deeper, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't about hygiene or routine. No, there was something more profound going on, something I couldn't ignore. The way he said it, the look in his eyes, it felt like an invitation. Like he was asking me, pleading with me, to understand what he was struggling with. But then he'd shut me down, the walls coming up so fast I barely had time to react. I sat down at the kitchen table, my head spinning, trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. I knew I couldn't let this moment slip away. But what was I supposed to do with it? I couldn't force him to talk, couldn't make him open up. And yet, the desire to reach him, to find a way to connect with him, gnawed at me. That's when I heard the footsteps. Soft at first, then louder as they approached. The quiet was unbearable. It was Ryan moving through the house, and I could feel his presence before I even saw him. My breath caught in my throat, and I looked up just as he entered the kitchen. For a moment, we just stood there, neither of us saying anything. He was still dressed in his loose t-shirt and sweatpants, but his eyes seemed different now. Darker, guarded. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I could sense the weight of something unspoken hanging between us. I don't want you to think I'm a freak, he said, his voice low, barely audible. The words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much he was carrying, how much shame and confusion he had been holding on to. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first. My heart broke for him. This wasn't just about the moment in the bathroom. This was about everything. The quiet distance he had put between us, the way he had built walls that I couldn't break down. And now, this revelation. Ryan, I said, my voice soft. You're not a freak. You don't have to hide from me. I don't know what you're going through, but I'm here for you. Always. He looked at me then, his expression shifting as if the weight of the moment had finally hit him. For the first time, he didn't look angry or defensive. He looked lost, vulnerable. It was like I was seeing him for the first time, not as Paul's son or the quiet boy I didn't understand, but as a young man grappling with something far bigger than either of us could have anticipated. I don't know who I am anymore, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know what's normal, what I'm supposed to feel. It's like everything's changing, and I can't keep up. The floodgates opened then. He sank into the chair across from me, burying his face in his hands as the tension that had been building for months finally broke. He wasn't just talking about the bathroom incident. He was talking about everything, his confusion, his frustration with the world, with himself. There was something else, something unspoken. Something he hadn't yet figured out about himself. The realization washed over me like a wave. This wasn't about a teenage boy caught in an awkward moment. This was about a child trying to make sense of his own identity in a world that didn't offer him the answers he needed. And I had been too focused on the wrong things, too concerned with what I had seen, rather than listening to what he was really saying. I sat down next to him, unsure of what to do or say. All I could do was offer him the only thing I knew how, my presence, my understanding. He didn't need me to solve his problems or offer all the right answers. He just needed me to listen, to be there in the quiet moments, to acknowledge his struggle without judgment. I don't have all the answers, Ryan, I whispered, but you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk. He didn't respond immediately, but as I watched him, I felt a sense of relief. It wasn't an easy fix, and I knew we had a long road ahead of us. But in that moment, something had shifted. The walls between us were beginning to crumble, and the silence, which had felt suffocating, now felt like a space for healing. And as I sat there with him, I realized something else. The hardest part wasn't catching him in that moment. It was realizing that the real issue wasn't about what had happened in the bathroom. It was about how I had failed to see the deeper pain beneath the surface all along. That was the truth I hadn't wanted to face, the one that hurt the most. Ryan needed someone to show him that it was okay to be uncertain, okay to be confused, and most importantly, that it was okay to ask for help. And maybe, just maybe, I needed to learn that lesson too. As the weeks passed, things between Ryan and me didn't instantly change. It wasn't like in the movies, where the problem is neatly resolved with a heart-to-heart and everything magically falls into place. No, it was messier than that. Fragile, tentative, like a string pulled taut but still holding, waiting for someone to break it. Ryan didn't suddenly open up to me every day, and I didn't expect him to. But there were small moments, quiet, subtle shifts, that told me we were making progress. Sometimes it was just him sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes lingering on me for a second longer than usual. Other times, he'd pass by, his hand brushing mine in the hallway like it was nothing, but to me, it felt like a bridge being built between us. I still didn't have all the answers. I didn't know how to help him find his way, or how to make sense of my own feelings toward him. I was still his stepmother, after all, and there was a distance between us that was hard to ignore. But what had shifted, what I had come to understand, was that this wasn't about me fixing him or making everything right. It was about being there, about creating a space where he could be vulnerable without the weight of judgment hanging over him. It was about letting him know that it was okay to not have all the answers, that it was okay to be lost, confused, and in search of something more. I found myself reflecting on my own journey as well. What had I been so afraid of? Why had I assumed that Ryan's struggles were something I should keep at arm's length? I had spent so much time fearing that my involvement would somehow cross a line, that I hadn't seen that the real danger was in not being there for him at all. It wasn't about trying to be his mother or stepping into a role that wasn't mine. It was about being the adult in his life who could offer understanding, patience, and a sense of safety. I think back to that moment in the bathroom when everything felt wrong, when I didn't know how to handle what I had seen. But maybe that moment wasn't as important as the one that came after it, the moment when I chose to step forward, not in judgment, but with a willingness to listen. And in the end, it was that choice that began to unravel the complexities between us, one small step at a time. Life isn't neat or tidy. It's messy, full of contradictions and uncertainties. But in the end, the most important thing isn't having all the answers. It's being willing to walk through the mess together, without fear and without shame.